You may have heard that playing an early knight c6 in the French is not the best idea because it doesn't allow black to play c5 and counterattack the white center. But do you know how to beat it? I'm Grandmaster Max Lingworth. This is episode 3 of How to Beat series. And this game here will be one played between the Indian Grandmaster Surya Ganguly, who was a second of Vishy Anand for many years, playing against Anton Smirnov in the 2016 Dobol Cup. This one was a French defense, and like I mentioned before, black generally should be playing a move like c5. For example, here c5 would actually be the best move to attack the undefended pawn on d4. Also, if we do take white playing a different move, like say if they play knight c3, then you're often going to see black trying to provoke white to play the move e5, so that you can then play c5 and attack the center. That's usually the main idea of the French defense. But in this game, Smirnov plays the move knight c6 instead, attacking the d4 pawn with a piece rather than with one of his own pawns. And what this means is that after knight f3, knight f6, e5, and knight d7, if you compare this position to the one we saw just a little bit earlier, the Steinitz system, well, I think you can see the difference, right? The black is not able to play c5 and attack the d4 pawn anymore. However, black's idea instead is to play the move f6 and to try to attack the pawn on e5. You might be wondering, well, how exactly should we deal with this? And there are a few different ways, but the one that Ganguly plays is a very strategic approach, where after bishop e2 and f6, so we take on f6 because that pawn is under attack 3 times before, so this just solves that. And at this point, this is a valuable lesson to take away already if you are someone who's either relatively new to chess or really looking to get better. And that's to realize that the idea of queen f6 is not just to take the pawn on f6, but this automatic move can also come with a threat. What exactly would that threat be? You can let me know down in the comments below and see if you got it right. So the answer here is that black is threatening to play knight takes d4. The pawn's attacked twice and it's only defended once. So the way in which white defended it may not be necessarily the way that you would expect, but if you want to get better at finding moves like the one that Ganguly played, then do make sure to subscribe to this channel, and that will help you to improve your chess and enjoy your chess a lot more along the way. So here you might think that a normal move would be to play something like c3 and just defend the pawn that way. But after bishop d6 and castles, what we kind of see here, if white just plays normal moves, is that it's not only that black gets a good game, but after e5, it's actually black who is starting to be better, because now after the exchange here, the bishop that was previously stuck behind the pawn chain now has an open diagonal. Black is the only one with a pawn in the center, and we can't even get rid of that knight because of the pin on the f file with the attack on f2. So it means that black is actually the one who is better at this point, meaning that we can't just play automatically. We have to be a little bit creative here as white. And Ganguly found this really great move of knight to f1. It's true that, yeah, this was something that he had, prepared beforehand, but the idea of knight f1 is not just to defend the move the pawn on d4, but it also prepares a few other ideas, where if black were now to play e5, we can now play the move knight e3 and make it very difficult for black to defend the d5 pawn, as Ganguly pointed out in his notes to the game. So instead, black plays bishop d6, and Smirnov, who, is not playing chess so much nowadays, but, was Australia's top-rated chess player for many years. Yeah, he decides to go for the move knight b6 here as black, with the idea of trying to defend the pawn and prepare the e5 push. Now, in retrospect, it's probably better for black to play a move like queen to g6 and maybe just build up the position a little bit more steadily. At the same time, if black's not able to get an e5 push, that also means that the e6 pawn will be backward. That's a weakness that we can potentially attack. And we're certainly not limited just to sitting around idly. We can definitely take the fight to black here and play a move like c4, trying to get an exchange of the pawns. We get some pressure on d5. We can try to kick away their bishop potentially. If they take, well, we can even take with the knight and just attack their bishop. So we don't just have more space, but we can get the bishop pair advantage as well. You can sort of see how this can kind of build up to being more and more problems for black, even when black plays in the best way. And again, if black was able to play c5 and just jump over the knight with the pawn, then black's position actually wouldn't be all that bad if you just visualize this here. But without being able to play c5 and without really being able to get in e5 effectively, well, the old saying goes that no pawn break equals no plan. And here Ganguly found another great move in knight to g4, just focusing fire on that e5 square. Queen to g6 was played, the knight is under attack, and one of the more underrated skills which I don't really see covered in a lot of chess resources, which I do make sure to cover with my students, is how to effectively deal with the opponent's threats. And in this instance, the move h3 is just a nice move, just making sure we keep that grip over the e5 square. Saying, well, black's already stewing in his own juices, let's just keep the position as is and ask black how they're going to deal with it. Because if black plays quiet moves, we can just very easily improve our position, just get the big pieces to good squares, and then eventually put our knight on e5 to really just clamp down. So black plays move e5, saying, yeah, maybe it's only covered by two pieces and attacked by three, but I've got some tactics. I'm going to try and take that knight on g4 and make things a little bit messy. And actually, it's a position where if you do want to train your calculation skills, it's definitely a point where you might like to answer the question of which piece you would take with on e5, and then you can compare it with the way that Ganguly played it in the game. Because if you take with the pawn, then black can take here, and if takes bishop h3, you can sort of see that black is starting to get a little bit of counterplay with the knight threat against the king. So for this reason, white played the move knight g takes e5 instead. And you might be wondering, well, can't black just take and after d takes c5, just play bishop takes h3 and go for this pin and the checkmate threat anyway? It's true, but white does have a few good ways to deal with it. Keep in mind that the best defense is often an aggressive defense. And that's the case here as well, where if you ask the computer, it actually likes to move knight to g5 even better. Maybe the reason why I didn't play in the game is, maybe you just want to avoid some potential like bishop g2 and something like this to try to get the piece back. Maybe it felt that this was a bit messy, but white does have this little intermezzo of bishop h5 to break the pin, and that will allow white to keep the extra piece in this position because you can't keep the pin on the knight to the king. That being said, the move in the game knight h4 also keeps a big advantage. After queen e4 and f4, we're just making sure that our knight's not going to be taken here. Again, you might remember from the earlier position that, a move that seems automatic can also have an attacking point. And so we keep an eye on, well, what is the opponent's threat? That's what allows us to stop that threat and allows us to keep our strong center, our pair of bishops, and our better development. Now here, black played the move of queen d4, a little bit of intermezzo, saying that after takes, and the attack on the bishop kind of keeps black afloat here. But white just played the move bishop d3. I mean, to be fair, maybe the move bishop d1 is a little bit more precise, just to not give the g4 square for black's bishop. But the point remains that here as well, white has a pretty big advantage. And it's sort of like an accountancy style of chess, which definitely, especially if you're a somewhat more advanced player with a bit more experience, then this idea you might like to take with you to your own games, realizing that, well, we can just build up the position, like have more space with the pawns, have the pair of bishops to control both color complexes. And we're basically going to kind of add these assets almost like it's Monopoly until we can eventually cash in those assets for something more valuable, like a big attack on the king or maybe the winner material that we can then, convert into actually winning the game. And it's something a lot of the old like Soviet chess masters like to go for this kind of approach because it's one you can sort of play even if you're feeling a little bit tired or not at 100%. So after knight c6, black is wanting to maybe think about a move like g5 and just try to open up the position a little bit, try to break up that really solid pawn structure that white has here. To deal with this, white played the move bishop c5, and after rook f7, and now the move rook a to e1. Probably at this point, black should play the move rook e8, and black's position would be worse, but the game would at least not be over at this stage. Black's at least doing a good job of holding back the white kingside majority. But instead, black plays the move g5, just trying to change the trend of the game. And once again, this is a good moment to try and figure out the move that Ganguly played here, because this is the move that really laid the foundation for white to eventually win. So again, you might want to, sort of discuss like in the comments, like what would be the move that you would play here. This move being move 22, by the way, in case you want to put the move number as such. But yeah, this one is something I actually cover quite a bit in my private lessons, where often when students kind of start working with me, and it's even true for some of the more advanced students I've worked with, like ones who are, going for the master title and such, that often they'll think, okay, the knight is under attack and the pawn's under attack, so we have to stop it in some way, and they'll just play a move like f takes g5, just very automatically, like without really thinking about it. But then the rising position after takes, and let's just say bishop takes f1, so that we keep the pawn defended. Black can then go knight d7, forking the bishop and the pawn, and there's one thing that Anton Smirnov actually is very good at, kind of turning the game around and taking a bad position and finding a way to hold it to a draw, even win. And you can kind of see here that even though White's still better, that suddenly White's structure is not as good, and Black has kind of created some chances for himself in a way from this point. But the thing is, White has a very strong intermezzo, and so an intermezzo is a move you play as kind of an in-between move before playing your intended move. So White plays a move e6, saying, you're attacking my knight, but my attack on the rook is stronger. And if Black were to take the pawn on f4, even though White is currently down a pawn in this position, White is actually going to be winning here because the bishops and passed pawn just completely dominate the Black knights. Even if you exchange, that doesn't really help that much because we're just ready to kind of push that pawn and get ready to queen it as such. So for this reason, Black decides to play the move bishop e6, trying to grab a pawn in this kind of way, like take and take. But Ganguly realized he can even do better than this, and he played the move of knight f3, hitting the bishop and the pawn at the same time. Black brings the bishop to safety, knight takes g5, hitting the rook as well. If Black plays a move like rook f6, we're just going to get those pawns rolling, like I say, push them baby, and yeah, just get a protected pass pawn. The knight's going to come into a beautiful outpost, and there's an example where the material might be equal, but strategically the position is going to be winning for White. Black ends up playing the move bishop d3 in the game. Of course, keep in mind they are attacking our rook here, so that's why in this position we take back, c takes d3. And even though it's a slightly different line than before, still the same idea of getting the knight to the 6th rank, where it's just like a monster with 1,000 eyes that just sees everything, which is how Tony Miles, Tony Miles, one of the very first British grandmasters, he described Garry Kasparov like this. So White plays the move b3, not the only move, but just with the idea that when Black does play knight d7, you can sort of bring the bishop around and just sort of reroute it to the long diagonal. Because one thing you might notice is that even though it's an endgame, the Black king is quite exposed, and we do have enough pieces to potentially do some damage to Black's king. You might even be able to swing the rook over, for example, later on. So Black plays d4, just trying to cut off the bishop, but we haven't played the move bishop b2 yet, and the bishop does have a lot of scope on this a3 to f8 diagonal. So Black plays the move rook at e4. I mean, personally, I like the move f5 as well, just to fix the knight on the outpost, but maybe Black White just didn't want to allow any counterplay with knight d5 or something. So he decided to go for the move rook e4 first, and then after rook f5, like trying to hold back the f5 push. You might be wondering, well, why not just take back the pawn with knight takes d4? And yeah, this is a safe pawn grab, and it is probably a winning position because you're not just up a pawn, but you do have the bishop versus knight advantage to leverage as well in this case. But in the game, I decided to go for the attack with rook f3, just trying to bring the rook in, and that's also a pretty good approach in all fairness. Black played the move knight f6 here, and that does open the door for White to play a move like knight d4 again if they want to, kind of using the tactics a little bit in your favor. But in the game, rook g3 was certainly thematic. And I think at this point, a lot of players would just assume, okay, the rook is under attack, and therefore we have to move it. But it's actually not that simple. This is something that a lot of your opponents are going to make assumptions, say, oh, you have to do this, we have to go there. But being able to look beyond the assumptions and look for alternatives is where you start to really play very high level chess, where like rather than trying to say, these are all the great things about my move, you kind of reverse engineer and say, well, what are the things that could be wrong with my move? And then if nothing's really wrong with the move, like you can't figure out a big problem with it, well, then it means it's probably okay to play it, but like kind of having a little bit of critical thinking first. And that's something a lot of people don't kind of realize till well into their experience playing. So in this position, Ganguly realized that you actually are not forced to move the rook away. And actually, if you do move the rook, you're also kind of losing the initiative here a bit, where black can go rook g8, try to get some counterplay with the pieces. So it's not all that simple. In fact, if you do move the rook, like that one little slip can lose you a lot of your advantage. It turns out you could also play a move like knight takes d4 once again, with the point being that if they do take your rook, you can kind of go d takes c4, and even though you are down the exchange, you're kind of going for this attack down the long diagonal. So, for example, they can't really take because then you take, and they can't take back because then they get mated down the long diagonal is kind of the idea. So you could play this. This actually would be a little bit more effective. Bishop b2 also quite a good move, realizing that if black does take the exchange, that again we're just going to line up like knight d4 and just line up that checkmate with the discovered attack. And even throwing in rook takes a2 doesn't really help because after knight c3 you're still threatening checkmate. Yeah, we did have to move the bishop out of the way because the bishop was under attack by the rook. But now black has no good way to attack that bishop, and if you do play a move like h5, you can even set up a little bit of a checkmating pattern with something like rook to g7, and this is sort of for demonstration. For those who want to improve your checkmate patterns, you can kind of see how all the pieces work together to set up the checkmate. And it's kind of a general principle in endgames. If you've got three pieces attacking a lone king, even in the endgame, that's often going to be enough to give you a checkmate. If you obviously have had the king on g6 instead of the knight, that would also count here. But yeah, in the game, black played a little bit differently. He played the best defense of rook to g8, which does at least keep the game going a bit. Computer is saying that the best move is actually to play the move rook f3, which is admittedly not the most intuitive one from a human point of view. But in the game, white just sort of cashed out with knight d4, just going after the rook here. And then after knight takes d4, takes, and rook takes d4. Well, we have a rook and bishop versus rook and knight endgame, where white is a pawn up. And in theory, the bishop will often be better than the knight on the open board. This version is not necessarily so simple, in if black did play a move like knight d5, just putting the knight on the light squared outpost, so that the bishop's a little bit of a ghost on b2. Well, black would have a little bit of a blockade to work with, and moves such as h4 in the mix to be able to sort of trade off the pawns. That would give black some chance to draw the game, maybe even somewhat reasonable chance to draw the game. But instead, black played king f7 and kind of bought white the time that he needed to, just get all his pieces to exactly the right squares and really leverage the long-term power of the bishop over the knight. The bishop's kind of like the archer, and the knight's more like the swordsman, where knight really benefits from the hand-to-hand combat and with like very direct sort of play. As you might know if you play Blitz, the knight is a very tricky piece with all kinds of knight forks, so it can be very easy for the average player to miss. So that's the way to kind of leverage the knight's power. Here, though, black's left a little bit too late, where white just has full control over the position. We, with rook b4, white's attacking the pawn here. Realizing if black does play b6 to defend it, that white can take and then transition into a winning pawn endgame with rook b5. Because, I mean, a pawn up endgame is generally going to be enough to win when it is a king and pawn ending, because you can just kind of run them out of moves and, just advance your king up as they move out of the way. But after rook knight d5, yeah, white just took a second pawn, and the conversion was pretty smooth. The game ended with a few more moves being played. White not even minding rook g2 because we do have a stronger threat of kicking their king out of the way so that we can take their knights. Or if they block with knight b6, well, then that opens the door to use the pin and, pin and win as such. After rook e2, yeah, white just, start to collect the pawns, rook c7, rook g2. And here you just have to be a little bit careful about the h pawn. The black could try to push it, but the problem is white has four pawns. That's the first problem. And the second problem is that white's pawns are also just kind of faster. Where after h3, d7, king e6, rook e1, black resigned here because if you do take the pawn, white's just going to move the bishop out of the way. And then the king will have to get out of check, and you just take their rook and you just win. So yeah, that was a very nice example, and just to kind of summarize how to beat the knight c6 French. But those I kind of showed a full game because I think it's good not just to see, okay, this is a basic plan, but also see like this is how you win and convert that advantage into a win by learning how to play the typical middle game and end game positions. That's what allows you not just to play the position well, but actually to play it like a master or grandmaster. So you can see that step one here is basically to just play it like a normal French, like defend your pawn, play e5. That's the first step. Step two is figuring out, okay, they want to play f6 and then play e5, and then taking a little bit of a prophylactic measure to make it hard for them to play the e5 push. And we saw that with this maneuver of knight f1 and bring the knight to g4, that this made it very hard for black to get in e5. And then step three is just playing good chess from there, like just converting the advantage, just thwarting their attempts to create counterplay just by keeping control of the position, applying it that little bit of an accountancy style of chess, where we have the center, we have the bishop pair, just showing good technique from there to convert our advantages ultimately into victory. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode 3 of the How to Beat series. I'm always open to different ideas of how to have, other topics for how to beat. I feel like I already have a pretty fun topic in mind for episode 4 of this series. That's what I'm planning to do for the month of October, and yeah, maybe even longer if you guys really enjoy it. I always appreciate your feedback and your suggestions for different how to beat topics in the comments below. But yeah, that's all for this one. So I will see you in the next training, and until then, take care.